Okay. Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Farinaz. It is a tremendous honor for me to be invited to speak to you here today. It's also great to see people in person again. If I appear awkward in kind of in-person interactions, let's write it off to 2 years of practice and not because that's just the way I am. All right, so I chose to talk today about a topic that I've been dwelling on for the last several years. Because after more than 20 years in the industry, I'm haunted by this mid-career crisis of consciousness. Have we made anything better? Right? And I mean this in both the personal micro sense. Have I, in my own work, managed to nudge the security of products that I've worked on towards a more secure state? And in the broader macro sense, have we as the field managed to make computer systems any more secure? Right? The decades of work, the billions of dollars invested, probably the hundreds of thousands of careers dedicated to making computers safer, and what do we have to show for all of it? Right? The fundamental question I'm trying to ask today is, to what extent have computer systems become safer to use over the last 20 years? Or have they at all? Right? And it's disconcerting to me that we don't have a crisp, unambiguous answer to this fundamental question. Right? So my aim today is to make the case for the dire need to develop the ability to answer this question and to somewhat sketch out the path to what that might look like. So first, indulge me in a car analogy. So, car analogies are like statistical models, right? They're all wrong, but some of them are useful. So while I appreciate all the ways in which this particular analogy is wrong, I hope you'll see its utility as well. So how would you answer this question? Are cars safer to drive today than they were 40 years ago? Instinctively, we feel the answer is yes, but how can we answer with certainty? Right, so I suppose we could look at prevalence of safety features, right? And unquestionably, a modern car will have way more safety features than a car from 40 years ago, right? Seat belts, airbags, anti-lock brakes, crumple zones, and so on. But does the mere presence of a safety feature tell us that the car is actually safer? Right? Technically, all it tells us is that the manufacturer has put in the effort and made the investment in an attempt to make it safer, not necessarily that effort paid off, right? How do we know that all those features had the intended effect in real-life outcomes? So I guess we could look at crash safety tests, right? We could simulate a crash in a laboratory environment and see how cars from different years fare. And that gets us a step closer to a more accurate assessment of car safety. But still doesn't really answer the question. How do we know that performance in a test closely correlates with real-life outcomes? Right? Like we all know people that ace all the tests and still fail in life, right? So the answer is, we can look at actual outcomes at an objective measure of harm, which in the case of car safety, tragically means fatalities, right? So in the US, National Highway Transportation and Safety Administration, or NHTSA, collects and publishes this data. So we can look at the data and see that, in 1979, just over 51,000 people died in road accidents. And that number came down to just over 36,000 in 2019. But even that doesn't tell the full story because the population grew. So if we look at per capita data, we see that the fatalities went down by more than 2x. But also people started driving a lot more. So ideally, we want to normalize by some measure of utility, in this case, miles traveled. So we see that by that measure, we went from 3.34 fatalities per 100 vehicle miles traveled in 1979 to just 1.1 in 2019. So we can look at this data and objectively, clearly state that traveling by car in 2019 was 3 times safer than in 1979. Right? Now, we can't credit this directly to car manufacturers, right? Because this is a black box assessment. We don't know what caused the improvement. Right? It could be due to safer cars, it could be due to safer roads. Maybe we're all just much better drivers than our parents were. But to some extent, like as a driver and as a passenger, I don't care. All I know is that if I get into a car today and drive a certain distance, that will be 3 times as safe as it would have been 40 years ago. Right? And as we shape public policy around car safety, same thing. We don't necessarily care how we achieve the improvement in that number. All we care is about that number going down. So when we look back at the process of answering the question, we see that ultimately the outcome that we care about is not some abstract notion of car safety, but the very tangible impact of saved lives. Right? Car safety outcomes are not measured by analyzing cars, but by counting saved lives. So, and the insight offered to us by this analogy is that in order to assess protective property of a system, like the safety of a car, we must measure the harm that arose from the lack of said property. So, and imperfections of car analogies notwithstanding, this reasoning applies to other fields where protection is the goal, like healthcare, like public safety, like computer security. Now, you may be questioning the applicability of my analogy because it's missing the element of adaptive adversaries that is so central to the domain of computer security. But that's the beauty of outcome measures. They make no assumptions about either the nature of the problem or the solution, right? So even if we lived in the Mad Max universe with like actively hostile adversaries trying to harm drivers, the exact same measure of outcome would tell us if the world is getting safer or not, if travel is getting safer. And so is computer security. The real question we want to answer is not whether computer systems are becoming more secure in some abstract sense or laboratory setting, but whether they're becoming safer to use. Are users of these systems experiencing less harm? That is the core of my argument, which may appear kind of obvious in retrospect, that security outcomes are measured in terms of harm experienced by users. And we can claim that a system A is more secure than system B if and only if its usage results in less harm. Or similarly, intervention X produces more secure outcomes than intervention Y if it leads to less harm. Now, here we must draw an important distinction between making a claim about the future, what we predict will happen, and about the past, what has actually happened, right? And it makes sense that most discussions of measurements in computer security focus on the future tense. When deciding between different products or interventions, we want to know which decision will lead to less harm in the future. But predictions about what will happen are meaningless if we can't measure what has actually happened after it has happened. Right? Our predictions in order for a prediction about future harm to have any credibility, we must be able to measure how much harm was actually experienced after it has happened. Right? Now, this distinction between past outcomes and future predictions is reflected in categorization of metrics. And business literature typically divides metrics into output metrics and input metrics. I prefer terms outcome and predictive metrics. As the name implies, outcome metrics measure actual outcomes, the results. That's what ultimately matters. In our case, that's actualized harm. Right? And they're necessarily trailing. The results have to materialize before we can measure them. Outcome measures never tell you what will happen, they just tell you what has already happened. As a result, they're not always directly actionable, right? At the time you're making a decision, obviously you don't know what the outcome of that decision will be. Right? Moreover, that feedback loop can take years, right? Years may pass between making a decision and the resulting outcome. So outcome measures are not very useful for assessing progress over time. Right, as you're working towards the goal. So for example, if you're building a car, you want to know whether you're on track to build a safer car. And you can't necessarily wait for that car to sell and get out into the market and be driven by millions of people over a decade for you to know whether or not it became safer. Right? So you want some predictive metrics that tell you whether you're on track to your goal. Right? So predictive metrics look at immediately measurable artifacts to assess whether or not you're making progress towards the goal, whether you're likely to achieve the outcome that you're aiming for. So once we've established a correlation, ideally a causal one, between a predictive metric and the final outcome, we can begin to make decisions based on the former. So for example, we can reasonably decide that a car with airbags will be safer than one without, if we've previously established a robust correlation between that input signal and the corresponding output. sorry. And that is a critical point, right? Like we can rely on predictive measures not because we can imagine a plausible hypothesis for why they should work, but because we have empirically validated that hypothesis. And that is why I'm obsessed with outcomes. Without measurement of outcomes to validate our decisions, our predictive measures are little more than superstitions. Right? So even though it may appear less directly actionable, developing the ability to answer the question of resulting harm post hoc is a prerequisite for developing any predictive metric. We can't begin to predict the future until we develop the ability to measure the past. Right? By monitoring this relationship between predictive hypothesis and actual outcomes, we can continually adjust metrics as the problem evolves and our understanding of causal relationship improves. So for example, 2 years ago, at the outbreak of the pandemic, a common predictive metric could have been frequency of surface sanitization, right? Like that's back when we, drenched everything in Purell and Clorox, right? I remember going into the supermarket and pretty much everybody wore gloves, but nobody had a mask on, right? But as we monitored the progress of the pandemic and we evaluated the efficacy of our interventions against real outcomes, our approaches evolved. So today we might look at mask prevalence or vaccination rates as a more reasonable predictive measure. But they remain meaningful only as long as they stay correlated with lower excess mortality. So without the ability to measure outcomes, our beliefs about what should work, again, are barely distinguishable from superstitions. Right? This feedback loop provided by outcome measures is an essential part of the scientific process. That is what the experiment and the analysis stages are for. Right? In fact, if we remove the outcome measurement from the scientific process, we're left with a direct jump from hypothesis to conclusion, which is, of course, the antithesis of science. Right? The scientific revolution was not enabled by advances in rhetoric and deductive reasoning that allowed us to form better sounding hypotheses, right? But by the realization that every theory, every hypothesis, no matter how plausible, still needs to be validated, right? And of course, the history of science is replete with examples of utterly plausible, self-evident even theories that turned out to be false, and similarly by totally improbable theories that turned out to be true. And yet, our field is based to a disturbing degree on positions which are based solely by rhetoric, right? Think of your favorite security opinion or advice and ask yourself, do you believe it because it is plausible that it should work, or because you have clear, incontroversial evidence that it does work to reduce harm? In the absence of outcome measures, we make guesses as to which inputs are meaningful predictors of outcomes, but we'll never be able to validate those predictions, right? So, personal example, right? I've been a somewhat vocal skeptic of SBOMs, software bills of material, at least as they are being pitched today. But what frustrates me more than the flawed logic of its proponents is the fact that we'll never know who was right. We will know who won. They will win, I can tell you now, right? There's enough momentum behind SBOM. Like, we'll all have SBOMs, it'll be great. They'll be like the GDPR cookie pop-ups. But we will never know if that investment resulted in any meaningful harm reduction. Right? And the same applies to most kind of cybersecurity, mandates and regulation. Right? We will know whether effort was exerted, whether the investment was made, but not whether it produced any measurable outcome. And as bad as the discourse around COVID-related public policy has been, imagine what it would have been like if we had no outcome data. Imagine how much less effective, how much more wasteful our response strategies would be, and yet that is the everyday reality of our field, right? Let me ask this question. How, raise your hand if you, in the last 2 years, refreshed some, COVID dashboard that shows mortality data or case incidents more than 100 times. All right. Okay. Now, for each of those times, how often did you check similar data in your field of expertise, in your profession? think I just triggered a bunch of divisions by 0. Now, don't despair, because that sad realization hides hope within it. Imagine the staggering rate of progress, thank you, that we can unleash if we allow meaningful outcome metrics to guide us. See, the market is remarkably efficient at optimizing for a number, if we have the right number to optimize for. Let me return to the existential question I started with. Have we made anything better? On the one hand, there's no shortage of progress to point to. Right? Companies are certainly paying way more attention to security than they did 20 years ago. Right? Thousands of architectures have been redesigned for greater isolation. Hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities fixed, millions of lines of code rewritten in memory-safe languages, probably billions of devices patched, and so on and so on. Now, if you were paying attention during the car analogy, you probably see where this is going. Right? None of this data tell us if our systems have necessarily gotten more secure. They're all measures of effort that may or may not be correlated with actual outcomes. Now, you may be asking why something like a fixed vulnerability counts as an input metric and not an output metric. Let me use another analogy. Let me use a healthcare analogy. Imagine that fixing a vulnerability is like administering a vaccine. Right? And the outcome that we really care about is not the number of vaccines administered, it's the resulting effect on excess mortality, or at the very least on the number and severity of cases. Similarly, in computer security, the real outcome we care about is not the number of vulnerabilities fixed, but the resulting decrease in harm experienced by users. Again, remember, when we want to measure security outcomes, we don't want to assess any property of the system that we've designed, of the computer system. We want to measure the resulting effect on the user. Now, unfortunately, measures of activity are the most common measure that we have. It's easy to measure, it's readily available, and it intuitively feels like it should be useful. So, consider assessments and labeling schemes like the cyber ITL. They take software binaries, look at the safety features present, functions used, performance under crash, and so on. These are all great things. Obviously, these are all the things we look for in our products as well, right? That's, hey, have we stopped using stir copy? Is stack protection enabled? Is DEP enabled? And so on, right? Same goes for all the SDLC activities, all the secure development lifecycle activities. And in fact, much of my career has been devoted to deploying and evolving the SDLC, right? So of course we look for, do we do static analysis? How well do we do static analysis, fuzzing, et cetera, risk assessment, threat modeling? These are all great things to do, and we all do them, but you know what? Late at night, when the meetings are done, and the kids are asleep, and the glass is empty, and it's just me and myself, and we try to be honest with each other, I know that kind of deep in my heart, I have never seen evidence that ties these best practices to harm reduction. But something must be done, and best practices are something. Now, an interesting market dynamic develops when something must be done, but nobody knows, or will ever know if it will do any good. Ian Grigg published this insightful essay in the market for silver bullets. And basically, unlike an efficient market where both the buyer and the seller have sufficient information to make an informed decision, or a market for lemons where the seller is at a significant informational advantage, or the market for limes where the advantage goes to the buyer, in the market for silver bullets, neither the seller nor the buyer know if the product is any good, or will they ever know, right? Because the outcomes are not measurable. A distinguishing characteristic of the market for silver bullets is a lack of any causal relationship between decisions and outcomes, right? And since decisions have no observable bearing on outcomes, they start being optimized for secondary goals, like minimizing blame, right? And a common way to minimize blame is to conform. The community converges on a common set of best practices that everyone herds around. So when a company is breached or a product is exploited, the first thing we ask is, has the victim / guilty party, have they adhered to all the best practices? And if they have, then then the community rallies around them and we say, alas, APT works in mysterious ways. They did everything they could. And again, we rally and support. But if they did not, right, then we ostracize them and we point at them with righteous indignation. It's like, no wonder they got hacked, right? And it doesn't matter if best practices work or not, because the goal is no longer harm reduction, but blame reduction. And who can blame you for following best practices? Right. So personally, I think the market for silver bullets seems to explain a lot of what we see in the security industry. It may also explain why you don't see greater adoption of your ideas in the industry, or for academic ideas, because it's not that we don't know. Like, we know how to read, right? We have Twitter. I follow you. It's not that we don't care. Trust me, I've probably lost more sleep over this than you have. But the benefit can't be quantified, right? The cost can. Like, we can sit down and we can figure out how much it's going to cost in terms of engineering time, in terms of die area, in terms of memory, in terms of compute power. But the benefit can't. Not just predictively into the future, but even after the fact, even after we deploy it, even after years pass. Like, we will be able to say exactly how much it cost, but not what we got for it, right? So it ends up being not an engineering discussion, not even a business discussion. It becomes an argument of faith. Right? How much do you really believe that this is worth it, even though there will never be data to support it? And nobody will have as much faith in your baby as you, right? Which is why in kind of most cases that I'm familiar with of a successful adoption of especially defensive technology, kind of an academic idea in industry, were cases where the PI made the leap from academia and went into industry and made it their life's work to bring their idea to life. Because it can only survive based on that faith. Now, as much as I like this rational economics-based explanation, and I highly urge everybody to go and read the full essay, there may be a much more simple reason for the same behavior rooted in human nature. Because when faced with new challenges, two types of approaches emerge. Those that help us gain control over the situation, and those that help us feel in control over the situation. Right? And feeling of control is a powerful human need. And if we can't satisfied with actual control, like being able to influence outcomes, then we do the next best thing and delude ourselves into believing that our actions are having the desired impact, even though we cannot observe it. At least that's the explanation psychologists have for the staying power of superstitions. Right? They provide us with a sense of control over the unknown and relief from anxiety. Something must be done, and best practices are something. So I remember this great sense of catharsis after participating in the very first BSIM survey. BSIM is this great project where they basically catalog the SDLC activities of many different companies, and they allow you to see how you map out relative to others. Right? And it was such a relief to discover so much commonality between security activities practiced by all the participating companies. Right? We may all be making it up as we go along, but at least we're all making up the same stuff. Right? And I found it greatly reassuring, as did many of the other participants. And that sense of validation and relief we felt came from the safety of the herd. Right? And while we all wholeheartedly embrace these best practices, the truth is best practices devoid of outcome measures are still just superstitions. And if that claim comes across as borderline blasphemous, consider whether you're feeling that way because you just kind of feel it in your bones, or because you can prove it to me with data. Right? So, this text is, or this quote is from a sociology text about organizational superstitions. As they continue to provide meaning and comfort to group members, they also become transformed into non-discussable assumptions, even though they may not be correlated with actual performance. To me, this covers so much of the security discourse, cuts a little bit too close to the heart. All right, But to be fair, there has been research that shows that SDLC has effects, right? So in 2011, Dan Kaminsky at Kensec West presented his fuzz marking research on the hardening of OpenOffice and Microsoft Office applications over time. So Dan demonstrated that using contemporary fuzzing tools, it was becoming much harder to find vulnerabilities in the 2010 versions of the product than the 2003 version. Now, strictly speaking, this research demonstrates that exploitation has gotten harder, not that it necessarily led to less exploitation or decreased harm. So, in our car analogy, this is closer to laboratory crash testing, right? Which must still be shown to be empirically correlated with real-life outcomes. But difficulty of exploitation is a noteworthy metric, and it's a considerable step up from just measuring activity. Now, getting a purely algorithmic measure of exploitation difficulty is hard, may not be possible, but the market does provide an alternative, possibly a better one. Ooh, actually, I realized I don't know how to zoom in on a chart. Anyway, so we can track publicized exploit acquisition prices. And perhaps the best known is the price list published by Zerodium. Yeah, I realized I can't zoom in. Anyway, don't worry about it. I'm sure most of you have seen the Zerodium chart. Now, this is a particularly opaque market, right? And much of the published material is marketing. So it has to be taken with a grain of salt. Nonetheless, my understanding is that it's a fairly representative data point. Right? And if we're to believe it, it does give us something to be proud of, right? Because today, a zero-click full chain with persistent compromise against the modern smartphone is over $2 million, right? Which is certainly higher than it would have been 20 years ago, probably by several orders of magnitude. Now, like every other metric, exploit prices are not a perfect measure. Not every product, earns a vibrant exploit market. Plus, a low exploit price, maybe because the target is insecure, or it just could be because it's irrelevant to the attacker, right? And there's no demand. Oh, by the way, one thing I should point out about exploit prices. So when you think about the current rate of exploit prices, one thing to consider is what is a reasonable exploit price we should expect or demand for a consumer product? $10,000, $100,000, $1 million, $10 million, $100 million? Hold on to that thought. Beyond the higher cost of exploits, there's been another qualitative change over the last 2 decades. Today, governments and government-backed attackers are now explicitly part of the threat model for consumer goods, for consumer-grade devices. I think this is miraculous and underappreciated. First of all, it was certainly not the case 20 years ago. State-sponsored attackers were explicitly outside of the threat model, not just for consumer devices, but for most commercial products. Right. Second, I can't think of anything else in the history of commerce that has aimed for such high a bar. Right? True, we're not always reaching it, but to even have it as an explicit goal is mind-boggling if you just think about it. So I like to say that there's nothing in my house that can survive a 3-year-old with scissors, right? And yet we have a routine expectation that the software in our devices can withstand targeted attacks from trained state forces, right? I'm not saying that the expectation is not warranted or that we always meet it, but I'm saying that it is staggeringly unprecedented and commonly underappreciated. And it is a reflection of the immense progress we have made. And by the way, like 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, if you had asked me, I would have thought it was impossible. Like, I didn't think it would have been economically viable to have even a vandal-proof consumer-grade device. Because again, there is nothing in history of commerce that has ever been able to achieve that before. So the high exploit costs and the ambitious threat models are two things that give me some comfort that we have made things better. Sorry. Now, we should not get carried away, though. The cost of exploitation instinctively implies a direct correlation with higher level of security. We believe that the higher the cost, the less likely someone will be victimized. Now, of course, as plausible as it sounds, like all scientific hypothesis, it needs to be empirically validated to be believed. And for that, we need to have true measurable outcomes. Although we expect the demand for exploits to decrease with price, it may not be a universal principle. It may be possible that above a certain threshold, the exploit market becomes inelastic and no longer responds to price, right? So it's entirely possible that the only tangible outcome of higher exploit prices are higher profit margins for exploit brokers, right? Like they may cost twice as much, which just means that somebody pays twice as much. Nonetheless, exploit prices can be a very useful feedback function, and one that I personally wish was more readily available. Unfortunately, in part due to the growing stigma associated with the exploit trade, we seem to be moving in the opposite direction and pushing the exploit market further into the shadows. Now, this might be a worthwhile trade-off if we could just point to the resulting reduction in harm. Of course, we can't. Now, another important measure that's somewhat related to cost of exploitation is time to patch. The theory is that the faster we can close the window of opportunity for the attacker, the less damage they may be able to do. And perhaps the less they would be willing to pay for the exploit. And the good news is that in recent years, we've seen a steady rise in exploit prices and a similarly steady a decrease in patching times. And again, while we have yet to see clear correlation with harm reduction, progress along these two dimensions has produced some interesting second-order effects. My sense is that the success on these two fronts is one of the main drivers behind the rise in supply chain attacks. Why attack the hardened endpoint when you can inject your attack upstream in the supply chain and rely on all that wonderful update infrastructure to push it out to all the endpoints? Right. This is the problem with complex systems, right? Complex systems and emergent properties with adaptive players are impossible to reason about deductively. Right. We must rely on an iterative evolutionary approach with a tight feedback loop that can only be provided by outcome measures. Working with just an assumed correlation between predictive metrics and assumed correlation between predictive metrics and actual outcomes may evolve over time. And the only way for us to be sure that we're still working on the right things is to continuously monitor outcomes. So that brings us back to outcome metrics and measuring outcomes. Again, ideally, what we want to measure is reduction in harm over time, right? And we want to see our losses due to insecurity going down or coming up. Right? And that will tell us whether we're doing something right or whether we're doing enough right. Now, who should be the authoritative source for these data? We're not the only profession with the goal of reducing harm, and we can learn a lot from how other similar domains approach outcome metrics. Who provides data for car fatalities, for crime losses, and public health? At least in the US, this data comes from federal government, right? So NHTSA provides outcome data for car safety, CDC for vaccine effectiveness, FBI for crime. And crime is actually a good analogy because in a sense, product security at its core is crime prevention. So what we're looking for is this kind of sort of crime data to guide our activities. And we do have some, right? So actually, at least for the last decade, FBI IC3 has been publishing this data on losses due to cybercrime. Three things draw my attention in this chart. And I'm going to go through them in order of reverse conspicuousness. So least noticeable, but most consequential are the units on the vertical axis. Right? Unlike the charts on the previous page, these are in dollars and not in lives. Right? And that's something, right? Like not thousands, not hundreds, not even tens of lives per year. Right? We're lucky enough and perhaps successful enough to still be denominating our losses in dollars and not in lives. And this was not a foregone conclusion 20 years ago, nor is it for the next 20 years. But at least today, we can take solace in the fact that we can afford to measure our losses in dollars and not lives. Should also point out that we haven't even tried to figure out how to normalize this data by a measure of utility, like we did with cars by mile traveled. Right? Like, what should our measure of utility be? Is it per byte sent? Per transistor state switch? Like, how do we know that this is just not, this doesn't just reflect greater usage of computers, right? Oops. Now, the second point, sorry, and I jumped ahead a little bit. The second point here is that these numbers are just too small. Sorry. Right. And this has been a common criticism of this particular data set, that it's almost certainly undercounting. There's underreporting and undercounting. Right. In fact, the other thing that should be shown alongside this is whenever we show losses, we should also show the cost of prevention, because the cost of prevention probably dwarfs these numbers, right? And from an economic standpoint, it's hard for me to see the difference between $1 lost to theft and $1 spent on theft prevention, right? And finally, kind of the third thing that kind of jumps out from this chart, and the most noticeable one, is it's clearly not trending in the direction we want it to be trending in, right? So what is it? Like, where are we not making the right progress, right? Are we not patching fast enough? Are we not switching to Rust fast enough? Do we need more machine learning? I don't know, apparently. That's blockchain. Yes, clearly the answer is blockchain. I think actually if we were to plot correlation with blockchain, then anyway, so I forgot that I won't be able to zoom in, so unfortunately I don't know how well you can read the x-axis on the chart on the right, but FBI does break down this data by type of loss. And even though this is all undercounting, let's, for the sake of argument, assume that it's at least representative, right? That there is not just like major undercounting in some category, but not in others. And this is not by type of attack, but by type of crime. And what we see is it's all fraud. It's all social engineering, right? None of it is exploitation, or almost none of it. I think, let's see, ransomware is like here somewhere. And most ransomware still doesn't spread through exploitation. It's mostly credential reuse. So like malware is like here. So if we snapped our fingers and fixed all memory corruption overnight, it would have no perceivable impact on this chart. In fact, if we probably deployed pretty much every mitigation proposed in kind of most top 4 conferences in the last 10 years, I'm not sure how much change it would have on this chart. So let me return to my original question. Have computer systems become safer to use in the last 20 years? And the awkward reality is that we as a field cannot objectively answer this question. In all these years, through all that effort, we haven't gotten around to collecting the data necessary to answer this fundamental question. And this has serious detrimental consequences for our field. On a positive note, I hope I convinced you that we can measure security outcomes, that security outcomes are measurable and therefore security is measurable. Unfortunately, today, most of what we measure is activity. Without proper outcome measures to provide feedback, we're operating in the dark and most of our predictive measures are questionable at best. We want to be useful, so we believe that what we do is helpful, and we measure how much help we have delivered, not how much difference it has made. Now, based on measures of actualized harm, we could identify and iterate on predictive measures which would be correlated with a reduction in harm. Now, we're still dealing with adaptive adversaries and emergent properties, so we would not expect a highly precise or deterministic answer, but by constantly checking for correlation with outcomes, we should be able to develop good heuristics, just like other similar fields like healthcare and public safety. We'd also be able to better answer questions about potential utility of interventions. Should we rotate passwords, deploy 2FA, use S-bombs? Right. Again, there's an element of unpredictability, and the answer will always be probabilistic, but by continuously correlating outcomes with treatments, we will be able to break out of the market for silver bullets. And until then, until we have established a robust measure of outcomes, there are indications that we're being highly inefficient in our allocation of defensive resources. We spend efforts in pursuit of silver bullets, either for their herd protection properties or for psychological safety that superstitions offer. Now, we're not entirely without a feedback loop. The invisible hand of the market, so to speak, does provide some guidance, and subjectively, the security of computer systems have improved drastically over the last 20 years. But a tighter and more directly actionable feedback mechanism would allow us to iterate towards better solutions much faster. Again, the market is very good at optimizing for a number. We just need to define what that number should be. So I'm going to leave you with this. 20 years from now, when you have more gray hair, or just less hair, how will you measure the impact that you have had? Is it going to be citation counts, CVEs, the number of systems your work has been deployed on? Or will you be able to point at clear data and unambiguously, with certainty, say that using computers have become 2x, 3x, 10 times safer over the last 20 years, and that you helped make that happen? All right, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I want to acknowledge all the feedback and insights I got from Dev and Stefan. Thanks for listening to my rants over the years. Obviously, all the kind of logical fallacies and inconsistencies and everything else that's wrong with the presentation is all mine. They did what they could, but they had this to work with. Just really quickly, of course, we're hiring. If you want to kind of spend your days arguing with me about this stuff, pretty much anything related to security, anywhere here in San Diego, remote, anything, send me an email or reach out on Twitter. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. If anyone has questions, come to me. I will give you a remote. Here. I'm going to make you stand up. Not well.
So, Alex, thank you very much for this depressive talk. I think the question, indeed, I have some gray hairs, so I think about my own impact. I want to give one or two comments, very short one, and also ask you a question about the impact of academia.
Wait, seriously? Are you starting with this is more of a comment, not a question?
Yes. No. I start first with my comments.
I'm kidding.
I think the one parameter that you may consider in your analysis is that the trends and the advertising power of some universities, especially in this country, and the public relation machinery has a huge impact on deployment of certain technologies, even if they don't make sense. The second thing is we pay with lives in security as well. Why? Identifying satellite communication during the wars, finding out and detecting, in the case of drone strikes, that is another point. But now to my question. Many people who are here, academia, I know most of them, the youngster ones, they really think about, I assume they think about citation and the papers to get accepted at NDSS, even if it is not AI based. But you said you could read and you are working with many academia. So how do you judge their impact? Because you are working with them, you give them maybe some funding or some pocket money that they find something in the area of computer security. So what is your view about those academia you worked with in general? How did they impact your work?
All right, so that's a very interesting question. Yeah, I must admit, sort of in recent years, probably the academic papers that I've spent that I paid most attention to were around bug finding techniques, right? So, mostly around fuzzing and so on. Now, and to some extent, again, if we kind of zoom in a bit and forget about the broader question of harm reduction, bug finding techniques are kind of relatively straightforward to evaluate, right? They either find bugs or they don't, right? So I think, I'm just trying to think. No, I think it's good. I think maybe in the style of the question, I'll respond with partly a comment. I think the things that maybe I'll say that the things that I like the least about academic papers are the motivation and impact sections. I think those are probably most disconnected from reality. The kind of the core of the actual innovation, the core of the science, that's good. I think the assumption about how it will be used or how it's relevant, I think those are very often disconnected from reality. I think internships are a great way to fix that. And in fact, right, like we've had a number of interns that kind of went on to tenure track positions in academia. I remember a number of interns, like one of the first comments that many interns make is like, all right, like now I understand that the reason industry isn't using more results from academia is not because people don't know about them, it's because there's like a mismatch between the real nature of the problem and what people think it is. Yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question. Okay, all right. Thanks.
Hi, Alex. This is Sean from University of Chicago. So I have a question in general about kind of your measurement. I think, in ideal case for, COVID or CAR, there are ideal, we just want to reduce fatality rate. But for mortality rate, sorry. And so for security, they're often very fuzzy, right? So oftentimes we don't have a perfect measurement, or the measurement is very noisy, or it could be biased. So in those cases, especially in adversarial setting, attacker could potentially exploit kind of the bias you have in your measurement to attack you, so that your measurement result won't show the actual harm that has been caused by the attacker. So I want to ask, what do you thoughts on that?
Thanks, Sean. Well, I guess I disagree with your premise, right? I don't think that the problem is easier in healthcare, with COVID or with anything else. I don't think the problem is easier in public safety with crime. I think in all of those, with COVID, we see that the adversary is incredibly adaptive, right? And we also see problems with bias in measurements and so on. And massive human factors involved and so on. So I don't think our problems are that unique. And I think, I don't think they're more challenging than problems in, again, in the domains of healthcare and public safety. And, if they can measure outcomes, so can we. Right, like at the end of the day, either lives are lost or dollars are lost somewhere, and we should be able to capture that with reasonable accuracy.